Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to paint a snowman in a jar. A full list of materials and timestamps are in the description below. Let's start out with the masking fluid. It helps me to preserve some of the white from the paper in my finished painting. Watercolor cannot get under it, but it might pool at the side of it, so I gotta be cautious with that. I'm using a small wooden stick to apply to the paper since it would destroy my brushes, and it's hard to apply it with a brush since it dries on your bristles and then you just have a mess on your page. The drying time is pretty short, so I'll just give it like 15 or 20 minutes to air dry properly. When I'm done with my painting, I can just use my finger to gently peel it off. I just rub with my finger over it and it will just come off. I do not apply masking fluid to the snowman because it would actually take off most of my pencil lines when I remove it. I took a picture for you guys to show you where exactly I applied my masking fluid. Let's start with the underpainting. It helps me to intensify my colors later on, so it is important that I never skip this one step. The glass on the sides of the bottle is translucent and almost white. In order to paint the glass, I'm applying a really light wash of turquoise and the cerulean blue. That is all you really need, because the really light wash will be translucent enough to make the glass nice, shiny and light. It doesn't really matter if I paint outside of the lines, because both sides of the glass will get a really dark and deeper color, so there's no need to panic if you don't stay within the lines. I can drop some more pigment into the wet paint of the glass just to give it some more color variations. The same light blue wash is also perfect to paint in the top of my jar. I'm adding some more pigments to the sides of it to already help me getting it darkened and darken it up for the further steps. I'm using the same color here that I used for the light wash, it's just less diluted. Due to the masking fluid, I need to manually move the pigment a little more around. It will not bleed as much as it would without that barrier there. In order to give it some more variation in the blue color I used here, I dry off my brush on a paper towel and I mop up some of the color and some of the pigment. This area also gets a really light blue wash, and I work in sections, which means I painted the upper area first and now I'm painting this area, simply because the watercolor dries really fast on the paper I'm using, and I want to make sure that I have a chance to add a little bit more pigment to the sides of the jar here, and I want it to bleed towards the center of the jar. And once again, the pigment will not bleed across the masking fluid, so I need to manually move it around. The cork of my jar gets a really light wash with yellow ochre, and I make sure that it is really light and that it stays wet for a while, because I will be dropping in a little bit of a darker color, in this case burnt umber, a really light brown, and it will be more intense towards the sides and the more shaded areas of the cork. Keep in mind, this is just the first layer of paint that I apply here. It just serves me as a guideline and to help me intensify my colors in the further layers. Since this is such a light wash, it dries really fast, so when I apply the brown, I don't need to be too careful with not having it bleed into the blue that I applied earlier, just because it's so light and it's already dry. Let's work on the background. By pre-wetting the page with clear water, I give myself more time to work on it, and it will be easier to get a really fluent and light wash on the background. The water I applied does not reach all the way to the edge of the jar. By the way, the jar should already be completely dry by this time. I mixed some Prussian blue with a little bit of lamp black to get a really dark and intense color. This is just a bit different from the blues I will be using on the jar, and I think it is just the perfect color for the background. I fill my brush with pigment and go around the jar and close all the little gaps of water that I left before. The pigment will be bleeding from that position into the wet areas of the paper, and that gives a really cool pattern on the page. I have to re-add a little bit of pigment here and there and sometimes help it move so that I get this really cloudy background. I work my way around the whole jar this way, and I keep turning my jar back and forth. An important point here is that I make sure that I do not paint or touch the drying paint or the drying pigment, because it will disturb the pigment and leave really weird patterns on the page, which I do not want here. If, let's say, the pigment that I applied first at the bottom of the jar is already too dry and I would disturb the pigment and leave marks, I have two choices. I can let it dry completely and then continue to paint, or I can just re-wet a widen area around it to make sure that I dock the wet paint only onto wet areas. As long as the pigment is still wet, I can always go back in and re-add a little bit of pigment to make it a bit more intense or to help it move around a little bit. I try to make sure that I don't have any puddles here, because they would leave lines or harsh edges, which I don't want here. I want a really cloudy and fluffy background. I let my background dry completely because I do not want to accidentally touch it and disturb the pigment. Now let's start with the magical cloudy content of the jar. I put down water first to give me more time to work on it. I also do not want any hard edges in it, and having water in that area first prevents that for the most part. I'm starting with the lighter colors here, and I'm working my way up to using some of the more darker colors. I just drop them down and let them move around pretty much freely. I help them to move in certain directions, and I just try to make a really cloudy and nice busy background. I'm using different shades of blue here just to make it appear even more busy and even more magical. I want the eye to be kind of drawn to it and trying to grasp all the different shades of blue that I'm using here. I'm painting the content of the jar in sections as well. I want to make sure that I don't have any hard edges here, and dropping down water helps with that, but the water dries pretty fast, so I'm literally doing the one side of the snowman first, then the top side, and then the other side. Thanks to the masking fluid, I do not need to worry about leaving certain areas white. I got distracted here, and I painted some of the blue pigment into the white area that the snow is standing on, so into the white snow. Well, after a short second of panic, I soaked it up with a paper towel and I let it dry completely, and afterwards I will try to lift as much pigment as possible off of this, and I'm pretty sure that this won't really make a big difference, but it just means that my snow might end up having a little blue tint in that area. The eye will be distracted and drawn away from it anyways, so even if it has a little blue tint, if the blue is too intense, I might think about changing techniques here and painting some blue streaks on my white snow. I also drop in some water and blue pigment into the drying paint in the jar just to make some more patterns in it. After letting the painting dry completely, I can do some cleanup work. In the top area there, I do not like the weird pattern that the wet and wet technique caused, so I soften it up with a moist brush and then soak it up with paper towel, or even just move it around a bit to make it less visible or less of a hard line. I'm also cleaning up my little accident from earlier. I just soften up the pigment with a wet brush, I soak it up with a paper towel, and once it's dry enough I can do a little bit of fixing work there. Some of the edges towards the snowman didn't come out perfectly straight, so I'm also doing some work on them. When I add the pigment, I add the pigment all the way to the snowman to have a straight line, and then I'm going in with a moist brush and offer the pigment a little bit of an area where it can flow to make sure that I do have soft edges. Let's move on to the next step in the painting process. I'm adding colors and I am intensifying colors. This cork simply does not have enough pigment on it. It looks flat and really boring. I gently add some water to the area that I'm about to paint to make sure that I get soft edges and no hard edges. And then I drop in some pigment. I move the pigment around to the area where I want it to be. I'm also doing the same for the top area of this cork. This cork has a round shape, so the sides of the cork need to be darker and they lay in the shadow more than the front area does. I need to intensify the color there, and I'm making sure that I let the colors bleed into one another a bit to give it a nice natural soft edge. The snow that is in the jar is not completely white, so it gets a really light wash with the blue pigment. And I also follow the same rule that I followed with the cork earlier with the shadows. I'm adding some more intense color on the side of the snow to make it appear more round. It makes it easier for the eye to catch that this is a round object. The bottom of the snow, where it lays on the jar, is pretty dark and it needs a clear distinction from the jar itself. So I add some really dark pigment here to make it stand out, to make it show that this is actually in the shadow. The snow that's in the jar here does not really get a lot of light. I want all of my edges to be really soft, so I'm using a little trick here. I lay down the pigment at the bottom area of the jar and then I go in with a damp brush and help the pigment move. The pigment will only move into the damp areas, and I have perfect control over where the pigment is going to be. Well, I had that little accident earlier, if you remember, and the snow is not pure white anyways. The snow needs a little bit of structure, so I'm also giving the snow a really light wash of that really light blue. Glazing is a really important method when you paint with watercolors. It just means that you put down one color and then add a second different color on top of it. The cork here has really light color as it is colored by the glass, so it does not have an intense color. I put down a really light wash of my burnt umber pigment and then I continue to darken the edges of the cork a little bit. But here it's important to be really careful to have only a very light wash of any color. I let my painting dry completely just because I do not want to accidentally touch any of the areas that I just painted that are still wet, and because I really want to glaze over my cork a second time. With all of the previous layers of paint that we already added, it's easier to see how much darker certain areas of the glass need to be. So I'm glazing over that rim and I intensify the colors on the sides of it a bit, and then I continue to glaze over the glass that we painted earlier and I intensify the colors there a bit. With the content of the glass being dry, I can see that it really needs to be a lot darker in order to make a cohesive painting. So I first go in with a lighter wash and then go in with more intense colors to make it really pop. Remember, the glass is round, so the sides of it, the part that bends away from you, needs to be more intense and way darker than the center. Now is the perfect time for a little mini tutorial on how to place the shadows. In my demonstration, I used different colors than blue just to make it easier for you to understand what I'm about to explain. In order to paint effectful shadows, you need to over-dramatize everything. I'm using 3 different blues. I'm using a really light blue and then I'm using a dark blue, which is Prussian blue. And for the 3rd blue, I'm just adding a bit of black to the Prussian blue. I'm working in layers here. First, I use my lightest blue. In my demonstration, I used yellow instead. I add it to the area closest to the rim, and then I use a damp brush to stroke it out a bit, to move the pigment around and create a pretty white, really soft shadow. Once the first shadow is dry, I'm going to paint the second shadow with my medium blue. I do the same thing, but the shadow is not as white as the first one. Once my second shadow is completely dry, I'm going to paint my third shadow. My third shadow, I'm painting closer to the object that casts the shadow, and it's the darkest shadow. So I'm mixing my medium blue with a little bit of black in order to get a really intense color. The light source for this jar is coming from slightly above, so all the shadow casted towards the bottom are longer than the ones casted towards the top of it. The glass structure that is casting the shadow is to be left almost completely white because the light is reflecting differently in it. Well, and that is basically how you create the shadows and some dimension with your screw-on lids or any type of jars that have obstacles and folds and creases on them. This painting is all about over-dramatizing every shadow you see. So, of course, the cork also needs to be darkened a lot and needs a way bigger shadow. Yep, I painted in the scarf, accidentally. So I just take a damp brush and add some water to the pigment in order to loosen it up from the page a bit, and then I can soak it up with a paper towel. Watercolor is always lighter once dried, and also it needs a drying time. So I keep going back in for my creases and folds, and I keep adding pigment to it. When you work up your layers of pigment on the page, you sometimes realize that certain areas are not dark enough yet or not dramatic enough. So I add some of my Prussian blue pigment to the side of the jar in order to make it appear even more round and make it pop even more. Let's start with some details on the cork. The cork does not have a flat structure, and corks always have a bit of like cracks and creases in them. I'm painting in some cracks in random places, but my lines always follow the same pattern. They go from the top of the cork towards the snowman in the jar. This is where the stress in the cork is, so it would crack there. The cracks on the top need to be slightly rounded. They need to follow the round structure of my cork to make it look more realistic. Let's add some more shadows to really point out the round shape of the jar. I'm adding shadows to the areas that the light does not fully hit, and because my previous layers of pigments are dry by now, it's easy to see how dark they need to be. A common mistake is that people are afraid to add really dark shadows. Don't be, it will just make your painting come more to life. Glass never looks really perfectly flat, and it also always reflects your surrounding. So I'm not afraid to add some more shadows and some more structure to the jar itself. Since the jar is round, all of my reflections and lines are also rounded, just like the jar. Now is the time where I can really see the painting come together. The ugly face of the painting just ends. You can see how it starts getting a 3D perspective and how you can actually see the jar getting rounder and rounder with every layer of paint you add. Painting glass is all about getting the contrast right. The contrast from light colors to dark colors and the contrast of the light reflections. As long as the general shape of the glass is correct, you cannot really get it wrong here. Glass always has reflections of light sources and of different objects around it, so don't be afraid to add more detail and add more shadows here and there. Imperfections just make it look even more realistic. The reflection of the light in the glass would cause there to be a slight visible rim around the very top area of the jar, so I'm painting that in as well. I also start to darken the snow itself slightly, like the top area that the snowman is standing on. I'm not exactly sure yet how dark it should be, so I just start with a really light wash. Let's move on to the snowman. The snowman has a red hat and he does have a red scarf. I start out by adding a pretty faint and pretty light layer of red, which I am then going to intensify in the areas where the shadows and creases are. Since this is so small of an area to paint, I think it is easier to just let this dry completely and then add this layer by layer. If this would be a larger area to paint, I would add a bit of pigment and let it bleed. But since this area is so small, I don't feel like I have perfect control over how much pigment is flowing where. The snowman is round as well, and just like we did with the jar, I'm now going to add some shadows to the sides of the snowman. I'm using a very light wash of lamp black and some of the red pigment that is still in my brush. It gives me a very light brownish type of shadow, which I'm adding to the sides of the snowman, and I'm adding it under the head because that's a bit in the shadow as well, and the bottom ball of your snowman also gets a little bit of that. White is never plain white in watercolors. It always needs to have some type of color or some type of reflection. Sometimes it's just the reflection of trees or the reflection of the ground. And that is a really great starting point on learning how to draw snow or how to paint something white. The nose of the snowman will get 2 separate layers of paint. First, I'm painting in a bit of white in the area that lays in the sunlight, and once this dried a little bit, I will add some orange later on in the shaded areas. The sticks for hands are actually quite easy to paint in. I painted them before with my pencil in my line drawing already, so I know about where they should be. For the eyes and the buttons, I'm just using lamp black. The red pigment dried pretty fast, so I can already add the next layer of red pigment on it to intensify the areas where I want the shadows to be a little bit. These shadows are not about getting perfect shadows in the perfect places. They are more about getting a bit of movement in the whole painting. So yes, I do try to add my shadows in the areas that would naturally be shaded, but if I don't get them perfect, it's fine, because this is just about intensifying colors and making the painting more interesting. Red and blue are colors that do contrast a lot according to the color wheel, so this is a perfect fit for making this painting stand out. The brown of the cork ties them together. This painting is all about adding contrasting colors next to each other to make them really pop. As the details that I'm painting are getting smaller, the brushes I'm using are also getting smaller. It would be impossible to create a soft gradient on that tiny little nose with a larger brush. I love removing masking fluid. It's even more satisfying than removing the tape that you put down on the sides to tape down your painting. If I wanted to, I could clean up the reflections a little bit by lifting some pigment or adding some pigment. Or I could even add some snowflakes with the splashing technique. But to be honest, I'm more worried about overworking the painting at this point. So I will just leave it at that. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to leave me a comment and let me know what you thought of it.